discussion of the Peloponnesian Wars by Thucydides. The there aren't many very great figures in this book. Famous. Once again, you remember we talked about Herodotus, and we said that it's that Herodotus himself says that it's about the deeds of great men, and that's not true of this book at all. It's hard to think of any great figures at all. Pericles is the greatest figure that is mentioned in this book very early on, and in fact, this whole period of history is very often referred to as the Periclean age, the Periclean era. It's often regarded as the golden age of Greece by modern historians. That's their way of talking about it. At the very end of the Peloponnesian Wars, you come to Alcibiades, who was a student of Plato's, Socrates, very famous, brilliant student of Socrates who went bad, and he plays an important role in the Peloponnesian Wars. But really, beyond those two very famous men, it's hard to recollect other men. But we are there is not a great distance between the Persian Wars and this war in terms of time. The Peloponnesian Wars came about 30 years, really, after it began, about 30 years after the end of the Persian Wars, which drug on for a long time past the great decisive battles that you read about in Herodotus. But they're very close in time.
So a generation, I guess.
About a generation.
So Pericles was born about the time of the Battle of Marathon. I don't remember his exact birth date, but you could put it that way.
And that was 490, right around there.
So in other words, Pericles was born, or was a little tiny baby boy as the Persian Wars came to a close, and he grew up in the next generation. Then you get the age of Pericles, and the Peloponnesian Wars break out at the end of that period.
And Thucydides himself, the war was contemporaneous with Thucydides. He died in the midst of it. In fact, before him,
he's about the same age as Pericles, maybe a little bit younger, but
well, he was a general. Yeah, he became a general himself, though he didn't fight in the Peloponnesian Wars. I don't even remember. He did. In fact, he was banished because he lost the battle, as I recall, earlier on. So by the time the war broke out, he was no longer involved in the military at all, and he
spent most of his life in exile. He only came back at the very end.
Yes, right.
And some people even say it was a self-imposed exile. That was kind of a question of honor.
Yeah.
That he had lost the battle, so he went into exile. But this period in history is considered by contemporary historians, that is, our contemporaries today, by modern historians, to be one of the candidates for the greatest period in the history of the world. And that fits, because it's an oligarchic or even democratic, in Plato's terms, time. And so we look upon it as something like our own. Within 20 years of the accession of Pericles to the democratic power, now we have to strike that word, call it oligarchic power. It wasn't democratic in the Platonic sense yet, but Athens was a republic. There were elective offices, and Pericles was elected and was the chief officer. And within 20 years, there's no question about it, Athens was transformed, and we would have to say the world, that is Western civilization, was given a sling. It's almost as if you put a rock and a slingshot, and it was a sling in history there. That is, a catapult, a spring, an enormous short spurt of history, which changed just about everything, but it didn't last itself. It burned out very, very quickly. Within one generation, that was the end of it. 20, 30 years.
Yeah, well, this was really, you might say, the end of Greece. Not
it was the end, yeah, and it was a flame, a shootout. I've just used about 5 metaphors for it. A slingshot. I just want to give the image there of a fantastic transformation of history in a very, very short period of time that burned out, and at the time would seem perhaps to have been lost, and yet made all the difference. That is, within that time, something had happened which did change everything. This was the invention of science, the transformation of poetry and tragedy, which we've already talked about, and comedy as well. And that is the drama, we might say, the institution of law, the law courts, architecture, a fantastic transformation in architecture. Phidias's friend, Phidias, that is Pericles' friend Phidias. My language got ahead of my thought got ahead of my language. Pericles' close friend Phidias became the director of public works. He was a sculptor and an architect.
Andre Malraux, 5th century.
Yeah, and no doubt a genius. And he built the Parthenon and built 100 other buildings almost as great. And himself did the sculpturing, a great amount of it. And what he didn't do, he directed others to do. And the whole city was changed. That is, it was built. What we think of today as classical architecture is pretty much the work of one generation.
And this, of course, was the growth of Athens itself. Athens became a great city
overnight.
This time, overnight, really.
That is, at the time of the Persian Wars, Athens was a large, small town. In the time of Pericles, it became the capital city of the world. Still, of course, nothing like the great megapolises of the East. It was still a city-state. And I guess we can't tell the population. It could be something like 500,000 in the time of Pericles. But that was, for Athens, that was everything. And after that, it dwindled again and became of less importance. That is, the great cities that grew up afterwards were back again in Egypt. That is, one thinks of Alexandria. And then later on, of course, in Rome.
Well, and also, you notice that Athens is a seaport. It is that is the Piraeus is the actual port. That's the place where Socrates has gone at the beginning of the Republic, but it's down the hill from Athens, which is up on the hill, but it's not really very far. It's a long walk, but it's not very far, and that's very unusual, by the way. That is that you have a seaport as a capital city. I mean, now in the modern world, of course, at the time there was no such thing as a capital city. Actually, although that is in effect what Athens became during the time of its greatness.
In fact, Pericles built the famous long walls.
Yeah.
From the old city of Athens down actually to the harbor.
Down to the harbor. Yes.
About 5 miles or something like that. Well, I forget.
Yeah, it's a long walk.
10 miles.
Yeah, it's and of course that is usually people have built their capital cities inland. Washington D.C. They didn't put it in New York. They put it inland so it would be safe from naval powers. But Athens itself was a great naval power. That's another one of the remarkable things about it. They were a great commercial power at this time, and that means that they were accessible from the sea. so that they imported not only the goods of foreign countries, but they became they became what's the word I'm looking for, international city.
Thucydides, incidentally, says all this. That is, we don't happen to have the text in front of us today, which is a good thing. Perhaps we can just talk in very very general terms, and we won't be able to cite definite sentences.
Well, that's what Pericles' speech talks about, the city of Athens.
But isn't it Thucydides' thesis that the Peloponnesian War was essentially a fight between a sea power and a land power?
Yes.
That is, Sparta was a land power, and there's sort of a geopolitical theory. This is all very modern, and I think, again, we have to come back and say Thucydides is a modern writer, as tragedy is a modern literature. We talked last time, the time before, about tragedy. Tragedy, or drama, because I think we do have to include comedy. Comedy flourished as well. Aristophanes is the great comic writer. And we can say that these dramatic forms are the literary forms that most perfectly reflect this kind of state. Or conversely, these literary forms become the educators of a people who then construct such a state. That is, it's a mutual influence here between the two.
Yes.
But it's what we today would call modernism.
And so such things as commerce and economics and politics become supremely important during this period.
I was just looking over the text a couple of days ago to refresh my memory, and Thucydides actually uses the word pretext. I don't think we've used that word yet at all, but that's a marvelously modern word. That is, what he says is, now there were lots of arguments given for the origin of the Peloponnesian Wars. For example, there was a curse, and he goes into some sort of religious explanation, and it had something to do with the Delphic oracle, but he said those were all pretexts. That's a marvelously modern word. As you might say, that story about Helen, that was a pretext for the old war, the Trojan War. But the real reason is now. What is the real reason? Well, you have a sea power and a land power. That's the real reason.
They were competing. They were
economic rivals.
Yes.
You get that modernistic, scientific, critical explanation, and that idea that everything else is a pretext. Karl Marx uses a phrase very much like it. He doesn't use pretext, but now it just slipped away from me. But he has a phrase where he talks about the superstructures, which he says are all just public show. But the real reason is the economic reason. As Sigmund Freud talks about the unconscious motivations rather than the conscious pretexts that we give for things. That's a very modernistic way of viewing things, and Thucydides is the historian of the age of Pericles. He admires Pericles immensely. If there is any hero, you may say, of this book, it would be Pericles. And the dominant thesis of this book is economic. It's not philosophical, it's not religious, it doesn't have to do with fate, as in Herodotus, it doesn't have to do with the destiny of nations and all that sort of thing. It has to do with money and power and economic exchange.
What they call a power struggle. That both of these city-states, Sparta and Athens, have long been fencing and fighting for power, for dominance, and it's true that there had been an enmity, a difference between these two great cities that had gone on for a very long time, clear back into the time. You can even see some signs of it in Herodotus.
Well, it's a rivalry.
There's a rivalry, and sometimes it became a conflict, and then Athens was a city that was expansionist. You automatically start using words,
yeah.
modern words when you talk about
Thucydides is so modern, I'm afraid that most people picking it up would just go right into it without any trouble at all.
Yeah.
It's very modern.
You feel at home in it because it's what we're used to.
Well, the style, very modern, critical. No stories.
No, it doesn't have that.
But debates.
Yes.
That is the structure, the literary structure of Thucydides' work is the debate.
Yes,
the speech, the political oration.
And we talked about this in connection with the drama, where you have arguments all the time among the characters. They get up on the stage and somebody makes a speech and then somebody makes a counter speech. They're very legalistic, and this book is very much the same. You'd say the outstanding literary feature of this history is the speech and the counter speech, the argument, and it does give the book some of that kind of dramatic, stage-like quality. It isn't
there's no stories at all.
There are no stories.
Almost no narrative.
No, it's all dialogue or dialectic, if you will, and that all brings in another element that was present, and another modern element that was present in Athens at this time, and which affected Thucydides very deeply, and that was the rise of the sophists as the educators and philosophers of Athens. Socrates was not typical. As is obvious from his own account of the life of Socrates, Plato and Socrates represented they were a singular phenomenon. They didn't really create a school.
They were reactionary.
They were reactionary.
The modernists would say they were reactionary. They were hearkening back, and in fact, there was some suspicion of them that they were sort of almost on the Spartan side.
Yes. I think we mentioned at the time that the Republic itself has many characteristics of the Spartan vision of life,
which was the old-fashioned view,
the rather ascetical approach to life, the favoring of the simplicity of life, and the very idea of timocracy itself, or of aristocracy. Those are Spartan ideas and ideals, and you can even say that Socrates was rather consciously criticizing contemporary events, and that's part of the reason that he was tried and executed.
Well, I don't think there's any question.
I think there's no question. I think everyone agrees to this. It's just that I think you can see it yourself just from reading the books. That is, that there were political motivations for trying and convicting Socrates.
He held up the old-fashioned virtues, where the virtues that the age of Pericles were all based on success. One of their big words is growth.
Yes.
That idea of growth, I don't know whether we've talked about this very much or not, but one of the marks of the democratic society, what we today would call a modernistic society, is the destruction of quality and the substitution or the dominance of quantity. The idea that everything can be measured in quantitative terms. I think we did talk a little bit about this when we spoke about
greatness.
Right, about Herodotus' view of magnitude, which is a qualitative thing.
Yes.
But when you get into this modernistic age, you deal really with whatever can be measured. Just to take an example, Phidias, the sculptor we just mentioned a few minutes ago, became most famous because he made a statue of Zeus, which was called the Colossus. And I guess somebody measured it. No, it was supposed to have been 42 feet high. I mean, nobody made statues like that. Well, the Egyptians did.
Yeah.
I'm sure it was a great work of art. The man, there's no question about his genius. But that idea that it would be something huge,
The colossal.
colossus,
That word.
it became one of the wonders of the world.
Yes,
It was
yes.
listed among the famous 7 wonders of the world by the later period. That is, that list of the 7 wonders of the world was made up. Well, I'm just guessing now. I don't remember, but wasn't that an Alexandrian list? I think it
so.
was. You know, it comes from a later age, and I think the Colossus of Rhodes was one of them, but also the Colossus of Athens, of Phidias, and all those 7 wonders. I couldn't begin to recite them, but they were colossal things. That's the mausoleum, I think, one of the great Persian.
The hanging gardens.
And the Babylonian things.
Gardens.
Right, that was one. And they were colossal things. The idea was something huge, something that you can measure in terms of number. And that becomes a dominant thing in the thought of Athens. Athens doubled, quadrupled, I don't know what, just simply in population. That is, there was a population explosion. And it was a foreign population. Athens was no longer a Greek city; it was a world city.
Yeah, and that's what Pericles boasts
in
his famous oration.
You know, there were. We would say today there were Chinese there, and there were blacks from Africa, and there were Arabs, and quite literally, that may have been true.
Yes.
Of Athens.
This of course is another factor that makes you feel right at home in the Athens of this time, and in this book, cosmopolitan. That is, it's a cosmos. It's not just a city; it's a whole cosmos, and that is an idea. You know, that's what you realize how much that is in the imagination, in our own imagination. You know, we say, well, what are the great cities of the world? When we say great, we simply mean the largest. We say, well, there's New York and London, Paris, and we're not talking about their quality. We're just talking about quantity. And they,
as you mentioned, I think when we were talking about it. Do you remember when we went to Greece? All those years ago.
Yeah.
We couldn't even find Sparta.
No, we couldn't get there at all.
It's not a great city.
No, and it never was.
Never was.
There are no buildings there at all. There are no ruins.
I mean, no Phidias ever came and built these fabulous buildings.
Yeah.
There was no great, in that sense, there were no great architecture. It may be that architecture itself is almost a sign, as an art, almost a sign of this. That is the building of cities.
Public architecture, yeah, right. Yes. Whereas all of the architecture as part of this domestic architecture, it's disappeared.
Now, Plato in the Republic champions. You remember champions what amounts to the small town.
Yeah.
The city-state of the Republic is not a cosmopolitan, not a metropolis. It's a small polis, not a metropolis, but just simply a polis. And Aristotle, who was, of course, a student of Plato, and who carries on this tradition, this anti-modern tradition, into the next generation. Once, I guess it's in his book called Politics, says that when asked how large should a city get, he says, well, it should never get so large that if you don't know who somebody is, somebody in the group you're talking to does. That's one of the answers. Such a poetic answer for Aristotle, who we normally think of him as logical and scientific.
Well, that's a good rule.
Very good rule.
It's a good rule of thumb for the size of anything. It's a good size for a college or a school. That is, in a school, it can be, you see, quite large.
Right. It doesn't have to be so small.
Have to be very small.
The small town you think of. American, we all think of Sinclair Lewis's book Main Street, which was so famous in the generation of the 20s, and where he criticizes the narrow-minded small town, the gossip, the impossibility of breaking out of the mold, the conformity. Well, Lewis is right about all that. That is, those small towns, when they get that small, can be very, very deadly.
Extreme provinciality.
But on the other hand, You can get up to 500,000 people, maybe, or 200,000 people, but that's a marvelous rule. You're standing with a group of friends, or sitting at a table in the sun in front of the cafe, and someone walks by, and you say, "Well, who is that? Is that a stranger?" Well, someone else at the table will say, "Oh no, that's so and so's son," and you'll say, "Oh, that is." It's that large that you don't know him, but somebody knows him. But when it gets beyond that, then you're in. Then the city is the lonely crowd. You remember that title?
Yeah.
Some modern sociologist wrote a book called The Lonely Crowd, describing the modern city, the megapolis today. And that's what you get when you overrule Aristotle's figure.
When we were in Ireland, we discovered how very, very small Ireland is, largely because it struck us over and over again how people knew everyone in the whole country, it seemed. That is, and once again, it was this kind of a rule that if you were in a group and somebody brought up the name of some Irishman, and someone would say, "Well, I don't know who that is. I've never met him." And somebody else in the crowd would say, "Oh, yeah, I know who he is. Yes, I've met him, and he might live on the other side of the island, you know." Or we knew people who, they were kind of walking biographical dictionaries.
You know, the poet we knew
who
did it almost as a trick. I mean, he knew for us Americans.
He said he could tell you of a certain district in Dublin. He could tell you who lived in every house in that whole district. That was a large district. He said absolutely he could tell you who lived. He could tell you every member of the family who lived in those houses, and their fathers and mothers and grandparents.
Again, that marvelous memory. The muse. That idea of memory that was so strong in Homer and in Herodotus, which of course disappears with numbers. You don't have to have a memory. You can put it on the computer.
Yeah, then
you don't have to remember.
Quantify. People begin to write it down.
But that Irish poet could remember just about everybody in Ireland. I remember talking to him, and he said, "Well, I don't know everybody in Ireland, but he said I would know somebody in his neighborhood." He said that.
That's right. That's right.
In the whole country.
That's literally true. Well, the families have been established there for years and years and years, and so there hasn't been much immigration. Very few foreigners go to live in Ireland. Really, you don't get that cosmopolitan quality at all. Even in Dublin, maybe you do now. I don't know, but I don't think so. This was 1976 when we were there, but I must say it was, well, everybody says it's a very provincial country. And
I think Dublin, at least when we were there, still has that quality of being a real city in the Aristotelian sense. I remember, again, that same poet, as a matter of fact. I happened to, at that time, have been a violent enemy of James Joyce. He sort of became, for me, the figure for everything that's wrong with modern literature. I'm sure I exaggerated, but I just used him as the bête noire. And I got so mad at these Irish because they all defended him simply because he was Irish. and one day I said to this man, I said, this Joyce was an abomination. And look what he believed. He said this. Why do you insist on defending him? And he leaned forward and he said, "Well, you see that table over there?" We were at a restaurant. He said, "You see those people over there?" He said, "They're Joyce's." And he said, "You have to be careful not to raise your voice too much in this country. You'll offend one of his relatives." And I thought that was the best defense of Joyce I have ever heard. The only defense of Joyce I ever heard.
No, it's a kind of forced charity.
Right.
Well, and besides that,
you have to watch what you say.
If you say something that is negative about someone, one thing you can be sure is it will get back to them. You don't need to worry in New York City or in California what you say about anybody. They'll never hear of it. But if you say a bad word about someone in Ireland, you can be sure it will get back to that person, and they will be deeply offended, and you will never be able to make it up. You'll have to live it's like living, next door to somebody. Then they become your enemy, and they're bitter, and their whole family then is offended. Then they tell all their friends, and what you have on your hands is a feud.
That's right.
When you do a thing like that.
That's certainly right.
So it does.
Whereas in the modernistic society, the worst that can happen is a lawsuit.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yes. And we all go to law.
We all go. If you offend somebody, libel, slander, blah blah, and then the lawyers take it up, and it goes on forever. But it isn't personal. It's well, gosh, what a thing it is to read Thucydides. We do insist now that Thucydides is one of the great writers of the world. There's no question about his genius. But that, like Aeschylus and Euripides and Sophocles, the three tragic writers, and although we haven't talked about them, Aristophanes, the comic writer, these are the four great dramatists that have survived from this period in history. Thucydides fits in with them. They represent what today we would call modernism. They're great writers and they're great representatives of it, and they're much better than James Joyce. If you want to read modernism, read these writers because they are men of great intelligence and they handle the language to perfection. They represent this view as well as it can be represented.
Yeah, and when you read
read these books, but remember, Mr. Quinn and I, we're on the other side. We're opposed to these men.
Yes, we're certainly
with a sense of humor about it. We
anti-modern, you can say, or reactionary, if you wish. This is not a book that is very entertaining. In fact, Thucydides talks about that too, as I recall. He says now, this book, and he's talking about Herodotus. Yeah, he doesn't mention him by name. No. You know that's who he's talking about. He's his rival. See, once again, right? You have these rivalries
He dismisses Herodotus as a teller of stories.
Yes, he says he's a kind of. There's a lot of romance in Herodotus, which is absolutely true. It certainly is. But the word romance, I've even seen them use that word. I'm sure that's obviously. I don't know what Greek word that would be.
I don't know, but that's.
But it's true, and it's certainly true that there is no romance by any definition you want to use. There is no romance in Thucydides at all.
Herodotus is. We talked a lot last time about women and the place of women, and in Herodotus, of course, women don't play a great role, but whatever role they play in the background would be a romantic one. And certainly in the Iliad and the Odyssey, we can use the word romance
in that sense, yes,
quite rightly. But Pericles, for example, I think we could take it as a significant. It's not just gossip. Pericles and his wife got a divorce, and he lived the great part of his life with a prostitute. Apparently, a very great prostitute. I don't know, something like a
courtesans. We call them courtesans.
Movie star. Just last night on the radio, there was what amounts to a kind of lewd joke about one of the political candidates today who was caught in a hotel or something like that. Accused, anyway, of being in a hotel with a prostitute, and he called a press conference and he said, this lady in question was an actress
and a model,
and he said there was nothing immoral, and so on, and everybody snickered, and you can't help it. I mean, it's just funny. But again, how modern that is. And the Aspasia was the name. Aspasia was one of the most influential people in the whole history of the world. One of the gossip writers. There were later gossip columnists in Athens, and some of their stories have been collected. And I can't remember, but somebody says that she wrote his speeches. Did you ever hear that one? That she wrote all Pericles' great speeches. Yeah. So that when you read this great funeral oration of Pericles, which is considered to be perhaps the greatest speech in the whole history of the world, the greatest political speech in the whole history of the world. We have, of course, as Americans, the Gettysburg Address, Washington's farewell address, and there are several speeches of Burke in the English Parliament. I mean, there are famous speeches, and then of course the orations of Cicero, if you want to go back again to the classical period. But the funeral oration of Pericles is considered to be the greatest of them all. And this guy says, well, it was really written by his mistress.
modern, again, the modern.
but she was, no doubt about it, a very political lady with a tremendous political power. She had a salon, and she talked to the politicians of the day and entertained them at her parties. And you're in a world where the influence of women is enormous, but at the same time, they're prostitutes. They're not wives.
I should have said there's a very famous woman in this. I said there are the two most famous men, but then the other woman who is almost as famous as they are, perhaps as famous as they are, and perhaps even more so precisely because she is a woman, is Aspasia.
Yeah.
She's mentioned very often.
No,
she's there.
Thucydides kind of leaves her out, but she's there, and she's there in history.
Oh, yes.
There's no question about her importance, and that I don't know. I forget now the question that led us into this, but that notion of romance. It was romance.
Romance, yeah.
There isn't any romance. Again, what is a prostitute? You buy. It's money. It has to do with commerce. It's the economic. What did Marx say? Marriage is the legal cloak of prostitution. That's one of his
pretext.
There you are.
There's
Pretext.
pretext. Yeah.
That's all what marriage is. When one thinks of Penelope or of Helen, who betrayed her marriage, but then was contrite and who knew it, but never was Helen a prostitute. I mean, that only Euripides could say that. See, again, only the reinterpretation of the story by the modernist tragedian, or the jokes. Again, it's been a long time, since I've read Aristophanes. I think I'll go back and read him. But we ought to look into comedy about this because it's modernistic too. That is Aristophanes' criticism of Socrates and his ridicule of Socrates is just as significant as as Euripides' attack on philosophy.
Yeah, well, and the very character of the comedy of Aristophanes is
the most famous one is anti-war.
Yeah, there's the one against war, and that also involves women. You remember that's the one where the women stop the war. They stop the men from fighting because they go on strike. They refuse to give their favors to the men until they stop fighting. That is a perfect example of what we're talking about. And it's, of course, and
it is funny. It is hilariously funny. But it's modernistic.
Notice that it's a comedy that makes a point. It's a comedy that has a political point to make. No. We say it's satiric comedy. Remember, I guess you've never met Aristophanes. Aristophanes is present at some of the Socratic dialogues, most notably the Symposium. Yes.
And he has a great
theory of love. He has a great theory of love.
See, the question of the Symposium is, what is love? That's the great question. The celebration of love. And 4 or 5 different speeches are given at that Symposium. This is one of Plato's greatest dialogues. It rivals the Republic. As a literary thing, in fact, it's better.
Yes.
And Aristophanes, it's devastating. His view of love. We won't go into it. It's in a way it's almost on the verges on the pornographic, but it is funny, and it is totally materialistic and reductionist. Isn't that the word that they use today?
Yeah.
It's reductionist. It's nothing but. You think love is romance. You think what? No, it's nothing but. Gets down to something physical.
Yeah, well, in fact, the very emergence of pornography itself, that is all of Aristophanes, it borders on
The dirty jokes. Very, very
pornography.
funny, but dirty.
At least the lewd, we say, the obscene, if not the downright pornographic. But that's the beginning of pornography, and that's a modern thing. So it's a kind of sex substitute that you can buy in the X-rated store.
We should just touch on this without talking about it, but we do have to mention it. That at this period in history too, there really was introduced into Greek society that attitude which utterly destroyed marriage, the family, and the whole fabric of Greece.
Yeah.
There it was. I mean, the Greeks became infamous finally, and they still are. It was called the Greek disease. That is this relation of men and men, and women and women. That is the lesbian poetess, pardon me, and on the other hand, the effeminate man. And this destroyed Greece. There's no doubt about it. And Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, they reject this out of hand. But it's there. It's there in the symposium. Alcibiades, as a matter of fact, was one of the figures of the decadent, degenerate aristocracy. The old, degenerate aristocracy losing its democratic virtue.
Yeah, that is a very great dialogue, and it does consider it's very difficult dialogue, but some of these great characters do appear in it. That is Alcibiades, Alcibiades comes in at the end drunk and gives a great speech, very famous speech in praise of Socrates, a comic.
Because Socrates refused his advances. I mean, it comes down to something as disgusting as that.
Yeah.
And Socrates, of course, was a pure man with a famous wife, Xantippe, who was weeping at his death.
No, in fact, I think it's necessary to bring this up for no other reason than to exonerate Socrates, who is very often. You see, this is a modern reinterpretation. Always attempts to identify anything that is great with its own ideas. So you'll find all sorts of people running around who know nothing about Plato or Socrates, who have never read a word of him, or who indeed may have read him, and go around saying that Socrates was homosexual. And you just say, well, you've never read the books at all. He's one of the opponents of this terrible thing.
And it is a very terrible thing. I think
that happened to Greece.
We do have to touch on this without dwelling on it, but we talked last time about the women's liberation movement and about how tragedy is the Amazonian thing in a way. It introduces the terrible woman, but even beyond that is something worse. And since our own world today is becoming infected with it, we do have to look back at this period in history and say, well, just if you want an illustration, what happens? Just take a look at Greece.
See, we spoke of the tragedy as being a pacifist, as being an anti-war type of movement, and that's true of Thucydides too. Really. I don't want to make out that Thucydides is nothing but an anti-war tract. It isn't, but it does. It certainly is not what we call a patriotic poem. It is or story or history. It does not. You see, it's explicit in Herodotus that greatness emerges in war. The whole book is about war.
Celebration,
and it celebrates the nobility of man under these circumstances. But that's not the case. You see, there are no heroes. There are some great men, and he does admire Pericles very much. But Pericles is a politician.
Really, he was a general, but not really. You have to say he was a political general, nothing in the sense of the great generals who fought themselves in combat.
Yeah, well, you hear no stories. You'll hear no stories in this about heroism, about greatness. In fact, it's quite the opposite. You can sum up the view of Thucydides, although I don't know that it's made explicit. But the implicit view of Thucydides is that war is always a disaster, an unmitigated disaster, which is simply destructive. It did destroy, this war did in fact destroy Greece. It never recovered from this war. It was one of those wars that it was a civil war, is what it was. And civil wars are notoriously destructive. And this war was indeed destructive of Greece. But that's not true of the Persian Wars. The Persian Wars did not destroy Greece at all. In a way, they created Greece.
As even the modern poet Yeats says, Troy created civilization. You do have to say that. That is, the Trojan War is the beginning of Western civilization.
Yeah.
Well, as you were speaking, another image just came into my mind, as if I were watching a movie. All these things again are connected. Go with the city, the breakdown of marriage, the lust for money, which is imitated in the order of morals. That is, money. That whole idea of buying and selling, the marketplace. We talked a little bit about that last time. What is a law court if not the legal expression of a bargaining? They even talk about plea bargaining, things like that. But isn't it really a kind of haggling over prices? That is, the marketplace. Something is auctioned off, and there's a bid, and somebody bids this and somebody bids that. It's very much like lawyers arguing back and forth, and then there's a jury that sits there and decides who gets which. And you find that that's what a play is. We spoke about that last time. That is the drama. The audience becomes the jury, and then the actors haggle back and forth with these set speeches. And Thucydides illustrates this. What is a parliament?
Yes, I was just trying to say a legislature or a parliament is exactly the same thing.
And they debate. It's the same idea expressed in different modes. I think the last time I was trying to search for a figure, we called our program the Integrated Humanities Program. And we chose those words very carefully, and the word integrated brings this out, I guess, most clearly. That is, our view is that everything is one. Now, we're going to get a dogfight out there, I'm afraid. We almost had a disintegration out there among the animals, but they're aristocratic, those beasts out there. That is, they fight for the right reasons. They don't fight for money. But I started to say that the idea of the word integrated expresses this idea that everything is one. That is, if you look at the way people live, their architecture is significant. The clothes they wear are significant. The food they eat, the way they eat, the relation between men and women, the relation between parents and children, the way they fight wars. It's all related. Things are integral. This is our view. And we can see cascades as of a great river of history falling down over cataracts. There was this period described by Homer when all things centered around some common single vision. of the whole of human life. Somewhere in the Republic, there's a famous quotation which the modern, not modernistic, but modern philosopher Joseph Pieper, the Thomist philosopher Joseph Pieper quotes. Do you remember that? At the beginning of one of his books, he quotes from the Republic, and it's a marvelous sentence. I think one of the boys, perhaps Adamantus or Glaucon, says, what you are suggesting, Socrates, is not just an answer to this question, but it has to do with the whole conduct of human life. That's a marvelous sentence. And that word integration is our word to sum up that sentence. When we talk about Phidias and his sculpture and his architecture, and when we talk about the drama, the tragedy, the comedy, the law court, we talk about Thucydides, we talk about their attitude toward war, we're talking really about the whole conduct of life which has to do with Periclean Athens. And it stands for all time, it expresses a total vision of human life. Now, Thucydides is very well aware of this.
No, he was brought up in it, really. And he went to school with the sophists himself. And he went to,
that's right. He and Pericles were schoolmates together. Their teacher was one of the most famous men in the world, and we know nothing about him. Anaxagoras. Yes. I guess he was a very great man. He was the first philosopher to teach in Athens. He established Athens as the school of the world. Isn't that what Pericles calls it in his funeral oration? And Anaxagoras was the teacher of both. Well, it's amazing. He taught Euripides, Pericles, and Thucydides. They were all three students together. And I'm sure he was a great man. He influenced Aristotle, for example. No question again about his genius. Mm-hmm. But he did introduce that idea that the sun is nothing but a molten mass of metal, and that strife is the origin of the universe.
Yes.
He also did introduce the idea of mind, which did have a tremendous influence on subsequent philosophy.
No, that idea about strife, of course, is tremendously important in the as it is interpreted in the oligarchic society and the democratic that's gradually becoming the democratic society. But you see it in this work by Thucydides. He says, well, you see, strife is built into life. Remember, this is the same idea that you have in tragedy. There is a conflict that is built into life.
The universe is essentially contradictory.
There's a contradiction, and therefore people are always at odds. You begin to get the idea, for example, it's mentioned early on, I think the phrase is used even, that the war between Athens and Sparta was inevitable. He doesn't say it was destined. He doesn't say it was fated, although he says it was inevitable. And that is it's very close to that idea of fatality, but there's no religious. Of course, there's very little religion, or there's really no religion.
It's inevitable in the same way that a chemical experiment is inevitable.
Yes.
If you take a little vinegar and put it into some baking soda, you're going to get a fuzz. That's the way they look at it. Yeah. If you have a land power and a sea power, you're going to get a war.
Yeah. You have two strong powers of any kind. They're bound, as he says.
That's not fate at all, is it? We have to distinguish that.
No. The fate has some sort of religious significance. There are gods, or there is at least some force in the world that in Greek tragedy is a malevolent force that introduces this ineluctable conflict into the world. But this is a different version.
It's like experimental science.
This is a scientific
version. Very
of
similar.
And you hear that phrase. That is, you hear it all the time. That is, and of course, it's an evil thing. That is that war is inevitable. But then they say it's inevitable. You see that men and women will fight. and they will be divorced, and that children will rise up against their fathers. That is, that the family is torn by strife, just as everything else is in the world. Society is full of people who are competing. The whole idea of competition arises, that people try to corner the market, and they try to get a larger share of the market. And this leads to, once again, to internal strife of all kinds, and political strife is.
We take these as axiomatic.
Yes.
That is, just as Euclid would say, everything begins with a point. The modernistic mind just takes for granted. You pick up a book by Sigmund Freud, and he says, now every male child is born with a desire to murder his father. And he goes on from there. And you stop and say, now wait a minute. What do you mean? Oh yes, that's just built in. That's the way it is. And his whole philosophy, the whole philosophy of psychoanalysis, is built upon this idea of hatred.
Yeah, and if if you say, well, I thought that
it was the other way around.
Kids love their fathers. Oh no,
that's a pretext.
That's a pretext. That's only the way it appears. That's superficial. You say superficial. That's superficial. You look under that to the reality. That's a superstructure that has been put on there by society to save appearances. You see, to make it appear that everything is all right, but really, when you dig down underneath and beyond that superstructure, you discover the reality. And it's always something ugly. Once again, again in tragedy, we made this point. That is, that there's a secret motivation behind what everyone does, and it's always a bad motivation, not a good motivation.
It's so remarkable in a way, because today these things are just taken for granted. You can pick up an article in an encyclopedia. Turn to a magazine where current events will be analyzed, a Time magazine or Newsweek or any such. Pick up a textbook in any course in the university, whether it's in chemistry or whether it's in political science. These things will just be all over the place. That is the basis of the universe is conflict. Now, modern philosophers, the most famous of them is the German philosopher Hegel, universalized this into a principle, and he called it dialectic. That is, the use of the word dialectic here means opposing opposites. Dia meaning two. That is a dialogic. It's the same word as dialogue. The idea that everything is understood in terms of conflict. And Karl Marx, as we know, what did he say? I have simply stood Hegel on his head. That is, I find this in the exterior world. Hegel found it in the mind. But Marx is a Hegelian, and just about everybody is a Hegelian. Remember the last time I think you and I attended a lecture? It was a long time ago. We went to hear a then, at the moment, currently famous man. Alas, well, maybe hooray, he's completely forgotten even 5 years later. But he came to the university and gave a lecture on one of the latest literary fads. What is it called? Reconstructionism or deconstruction? Deconstructionism. And he was at that moment the lion of the world. And he began his whole speech by saying, we are all Hegelians. It's just like this. And everybody nodded. However we may disagree, some of us are Marxists, some of us are Freudians, some of us are deconstructionists, but we all assent to this universal principle that the universe is built upon a contradictory and destructive principle. Well, here we are back in, that's not invented by Hegel in the 18th century. That goes back to this time of Anaxagoras, and it goes back to to this period in Athens.
See, the sophists they really didn't have the status of great philosophers. They were educators. They took boys and they said to them, we will teach you whatever it is that you need to get along in the world, that is, to succeed. But of course, because politics had such a very high dignity in Periclean Athens, Pericles himself was the model, that everyone followed. The road to politics was, and because of the character of politics at the time, there's the oligarchic politicians who were always all lawyers. You had to master forensics. You had to become a debater. And you had to learn the arts of speech, the arts of rhetoric. And that was what they taught. They taught language, and how to handle language, how to manipulate language, and how to manipulate other people in such a way as to win your case. And out of that grew a kind of substitute for philosophy. That is the sophistic position in philosophy that Socrates spent so much time opposing. And that's exactly the atmosphere that all of these men that we're talking about, Thucydides and the others, Pericles, grew up in. And it fit everything else. You see, because these various trends and movements and principles and habits come up at the same time, and they fit together. They have a way of imposing themselves upon
they're integral.
Everyone looks at it and they say, well, that's obviously the way things are. And so everyone begins to behave according to that norm. Now, there are always exceptions. I mean, Socrates was obviously an exception. He simply said, oh, no, I'm not going to follow. That is not right. And he simply turned his back on that.
Well, you will find, of course, the very principle, in a way, the dialectic being illustrated. That is, Socrates went against the trend of his times as well. But he and Plato were classified as reactionaries, and Aristotle as well. But that moment in history, that explosive moment in history, which we call Periclean Athens, has been taken out by all modernists as being the greatest period in the history of the human race. That is, if you were taking an examination today, a college entrance examination, or any one of these exams that everybody is taking all over the place right now, at this season in the academic year, one of the questions would be 4 choices. Which was the greatest period in the history of mankind? And you'd be given 4 choices. But certainly Athens would be the answer. Now, it may be that you could pick some other, but if so, it would be just like Athens.
Yes, you say
the Renaissance.
You say the 17th century, the age of genius that everybody talks about.
French Revolution,
Newton, or the French Revolution. Those would be 2 other choices that you'd have there.
There's no question that in the Renaissance. And the Renaissance was a complicated movement, and it happened in different places at different times. But that it started in Italy, and then it moved to England, went through Holland and various places. But wherever it happened, it recapitulated the history of Athens almost exactly.
Yeah.
That is, there was a tremendous explosion in population when it hit. When it hit Rotterdam, or again, the population exploded, the architecture, everything was built up in incredibly short period. That is, I find it hard to believe that all those famous buildings in Athens were built in 20 years. But they were.
Yeah.
I mean, you think that one would have been built, then 50 years would go by, and another, and 1,000 years would go. No, the whole thing was done overnight. The whole city was created instantaneously, just like New York or whatever.
Right. Well, you say again, these were all dynamic ages.
That's the word.
The word that's used, dynamic. If someone said,
like dynamite.
explosive. If someone were to say to you, well, I think the Homeric age, the Homeric age, they'd say, oh, it was static. age.
It
And
took
their
1,000
voice
years
couldn't
to
be
write
great.
the Odyssey,
Yes,
didn't it?
yes, right. Yes, yeah. What did they produce? Where is the architecture? Well, they excavated a few of those things, but they're child's play compared to Periclean Athens.
Well, they haven't even been able to excavate Troy. In a way, it is kind of interesting,
Yeah.
isn't it?
Yeah.
That is, Troy apparently was a beautiful small town.
Yeah.
It was not a great colossal.
No. Well, that's the way it was with all of the ruins that they've.
And that idea of a poem such as the Iliad, it's true. It took 1,000 years 500 years to write that poem.
And that's all there is. There's Hesiod, but that's all there is. What do we have of the Homeric age? Well, we've got Homer. That's it. That's it. We don't have all of this outburst.
And in the whole of the Republic, when Plato talks about the city as it ought to be, he really never mentions those things. He talks about the good, virtuous life. That is, the purpose of a city is that men would live virtuously. The Republic doesn't propose great buildings. It's not mentioned.
No.
It doesn't propose great art, even. In fact, he's got suspicious of art. Certainly there's not going to be any theater. You could just imagine, Plato saying, "Oh, theater is immoral."
Yeah, well,
destructive.
It's ironic, you see, that among the great achievements of the Periclean Athens is always listed Plato and Socrates. They say, this was a great age because
in a way
Plato.
That's true. Plato's own city would not have produced a Plato. I think that's true. In a way, philosophy itself is a sort of response to decadence. But the true aristocratic philosopher, such as Socrates, doesn't write. Socrates never wrote a thing. A couple of poems. So far as we know, he wrote a couple of poems. What did he write? A hymn?
Yes. Yeah, very little, and it would have never survived if Plato had not written it down. And Plato, in a way,
he did it reluctantly.
He did it reluctantly
to please. In a way, and Plato says in that famous letter I think we cited before that he never wrote down his philosophy.
Yeah.
He said he wrote popular works because he wanted to attract young people. But in a way, even Plato admits that the dialogue itself is a modernistic literary form, and he's using it as the lesser of evils, as it were. The only reason, Plato says, that I wrote those dialogues is that I wanted to pique the imagination of the young so that they would turn, but then I wouldn't write down what I taught them. From there on in, the rest is silence.
Of course, the dialogues are not dialectic. That's another thing. That's another thing that you have to bear in mind, because always you will be told by modern scholars. I don't just mean contemporary ones. I mean modernist scholars. The first thing they will tell you, and it will be on the examination you depend upon it, was the character of the Socratic dialectic. They will say the whole of those of the dialogues are dominated by Socratic dialectic.
Well, that is such patent nonsense.
Yeah.
You know that word patent? It comes from a word meaning plain. It's out in the open. And that is so obviously wrong that they get away with it. It's like
it's a big lie. We used to call it the big lie.
Yeah, the technique of
Truman invented that
the big lie. Yeah.
If you tell a lie big enough, everyone will believe it.
I mean, all you have to do is read a single dialogue, and you know that is not true. But by golly, it's in every textbook I've ever seen, in every introduction.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's one of those buzzwords. You have to use it.
Socratic method.
As
if he had a method. Yeah. There's no method there at all.
And there is, of course, there's everything in the dialogues. If you get people conversing together, you will sometimes have disputes.
Oh yeah.
Occasionally, and sometimes there will be dialectic. Inevitably, something that you can put a label on that someone will say that, well, that's dialectic.
What, there's myth?
Yes, there's myth, poetry. What we say is it's conversation. What it is conversation. It's dialogue. It's a word that is words that are exchanged among two or more people. and we've already talked a good deal about what is meant by
But you know,
conversation.
we might reflect on this just again a few minutes. The the great age, the aristocratic age, doesn't quote produce unquote anything. That idea that you're going to turn out a product is itself a sign that you're getting to the end of something. If the republic exists, and remember now, the republic is not an ideal utopia; it's a real city, and it has existed in the world. All that Socrates is doing in that dialogue is drawing together the principles of what would be the best real city. He's not proposing an ideal utopia at all. But he does admit that in his time there isn't any chance. Remember, at the end he says, well, we'll have to be content. At this moment in history, the republic will only exist in our minds. He does say that. Because there's no chance of implementing at this moment.
Well, the students all say, well, what about, could we really have this kind of a state? They would like to have this kind of a state, and he says, alas, no.
Not at this time. But on the other hand, it's not an unreal piece of fantasy either.
There's no absolute reason why it couldn't be done. It's impracticable, we would say, at this time.
And there have been times in history when we would say such a city existed and was practiced, and at those times there was no, what I'm trying to get at is there was no great statues, there was no great architecture, there was no great literature, certainly no drama, and I think we have to say there was no philosophy.
The Spartans, to the extent that they represented this,
they were philosophers.
Yeah.
The philosopher doesn't write philosophy; he lives it.
Right.
He incarnates it.
No, the aristocratic society doesn't really need the philosopher at all. The whole society is imbued with philosophy. It works. It is
philosophical.
It's built into
the only reason that you need philosophy is because you're losing it. That is, things get written down and things get worked out because someone says, "Uh-oh, it's going wrong."
Well, when the memory begins to fail, you start writing things down.
For example, you hear it said that of all the apostles, I try to imitate with my voice the kind of stuff you read. St. John was the greatest theologian. Well, that's ridiculous. St. John wasn't a theologian. He was theology. That is, but the Bible doesn't have any theology. There isn't. It's not a subject. There's no philosophy. Christ was not a philosopher or a theologian. He was the thing about which all philosophers and all theologians write.
He was the Word. And the truth and the light.
And the apostles participated in that Word, and they spoke that Word and preached that Word. Theology occurs later on when the memory begins to be lost, and someone says, "Well, we better think about this and codify it and straighten it out," and it's always a lesser thing. The Homeric poems were not written down. We spoke about this. They were oral. People sang. The rhapsode came like Demodocus in the Odyssey there, when he sings the great song at the feast. That is poetry.
And everybody knows the poem.
That's poetry. It doesn't get written down until somebody fears that it's going to be lost. So that I think it is a paradox. I think you used that word, or ironic, you said.
Yeah.
It is ironic that the Platonic dialogues and the Aristotelian philosophy was written down in this age. But yes, it's ironic, but it's integral. It's integral.
But because they are, they really are behind the times. Really, that is, they're
trying to preserve
of the age. They're trying to preserve something, but even they are in some way reflecting.
They're modern.
That age.
Yeah, they're modern.
Yeah. Well,
in their arguments and in their attempt to refute the sophists, they get entangled in the arguments. and they are, to use that word again, they are a product of the age. When you think about a thing like sculpture, in an age when art is aristocratic or even timocratic, there isn't any, or if there is, it's different. It's not Periclean. How should we talk about it?
Well, one thing is that it becomes domestic.
It's not colossal.
It's domestic.
It's domestic.
Yeah.
Okay.
That is, you have pots that have paintings on them, Homeric.
I mean, there is an art, but it's not separated from craft, from the handicraft. You take the Middle Ages, for example. There was a magnificent sculpture of the Middle Ages. We don't know the name of a single one. It's in the Renaissance that we know Michelangelo. Michelangelo consciously modeled himself on the life of Phidias. When you said that Phidias was the Malraux of our time, in the Renaissance, Michelangelo was an architect. And he thought of himself as a world thinker, and all of those things.
Yes.
And his statues were modeled directly on Phidias. And what is the quality of those statues? We do happen to have some of them. Now, I don't know whether a single actual statue of Phidias survived. Fragments survive, and copies, detailed copies survive, even casts. And I think some people say that there are certain ones, some of the friezes of the Parthenon might very well have been his actual work. But so we do know what his stuff was like, and I think the first thing that strikes you is that it's very unlike the domestic. I think that is a good word that you used. That's the right word that you used. The domestic sculpture that you get on the churches of the Middle Ages. So, for example, the first thing you notice about them is that they're naked. They have no clothes on. There's something that assaults the eye. That is, you look at them and you're shocked. That is, the naked human body is not something that you normally look at. It's an assault. And the next thing is these men with their muscles, that sense again of combat and of strife and of agony, isn't that the agon?
Agon, which means it's used of the wrestlers.
The wrestler.
The wrestler.
I mean, men don't look like that. People don't look like that. There's something fantastic about that stuff.
They're very often involved in, it's Zeus hurling thunderbolts, or it's the charioteer driving his horses.
There's no rest.
There isn't rest.
Anything quiet.
And that is everything. That is that muscular power. Once again, power is tremendously important in an oligarchic age. Everyone is concerned about power. You have these almost superhumanly physically powerful.
Nobody could be. You look at those statues of Phidias, and you just say, "Well, that's impossible." And you go to the supermarket, and there they are on the covers of magazines today. That is, these weightlifters look like that. There's something grotesque about them. Now, again, we can't deny the genius, of the chisel that was able to do that. So there is something magnificent about it. We have to admit the
of
genius
course,
of
that is one. You get two things in Phidias. You are astonished at the figure, and then you're astonished at the artist. The artist is there, and his genius is displayed. You don't really know, and you find this very frequently in ancient commentaries on art. They're as much astonished by the person who did this, by his artistry, his genius, as they are by the thing itself. The artist becomes a great man. Really, in a way, the hero of the Peloponnesian Wars is Thucydides.
Right.
He is the great historian, consciously.
The artist becomes more important than that.
And the artist becomes more important than Zeus. Zeus is not...
No, it's that technical or even pyrotechnical. We use that word, technical technique. You never call Homer a genius. I don't think anybody
Yeah.
ever called him a genius.
Yeah,
I've
right.
used that word about 5 times.
Yeah.
I think maybe the first time I've used it. Thucydides is a genius.
Yeah.
Aeschylus is a genius. But you don't say that Homer is a genius.
No, say in the whole 17th century was a century of genius. They had Newton and you had Galileo, and just the names just go on and on and on.
That's the title of that famous
yes.
chapter in Science and the Modern World. He
Yes.
calls it the century of genius.
Yes.
And he's absolutely right.
It's become a fixed phrase that everybody knows,
but the genius is a man who is more important than the thing that he does.
Yes,
that's right.
Yes,
that's the definition of a genius.
Yes, very often it's what makes the people in the 17th century so. Everybody thinks of Newton. They say, oh, Newton. He was the greatest man who ever lived, and really nobody understands his theory as a rule. People don't really understand universal gravitation at all. It's too difficult for them, and they forget about that. But
isn't that wonderful that it is difficult?
Yeah,
that's part of it, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It is. It's beyond us. Yeah. And but even Pope even plays with the idea that Newton created light.
That's right.
It's a kind of a joke, but it's a serious joke.
Well, it's very serious.
Very serious. He means it. He means it.
That's not the Pope, but Alexander Pope,
yes.
who wrote a famous line, couplet. It almost goes, Newton spoke, that's it goes, and then there was light. I mean, I can't quite recall it.
It's a parody of Genesis.
That is, man becomes God. The genius is a man God, and oh wow, today in the modernistic world, isn't that it? That is this deification, this idea that man is God.
Yeah, well, and again, it is a scientific idea. The things that science can do, the creative power, again, power of science to make things which exceed the ordinary power of man, and the kind of knowledge that man has now, which dwarfs the knowledge of the past. You notice at the beginning of Thucydides how the first thing Thucydides says is, well, there have been wars in the past, but none of them was as great as this war. This was the greatest war in history, and the past war, and he's referring to the one just over the Persian War. He said, well, that's nothing compared to this war, and it's all done in quantitative terms. He said there were more men involved, greater forces involved. There were more casualties. I mean, a greater amount of money was spent. It lasted a longer time. Purely quantitative terms, but it's all the greatness of that war.
Remember, just before we got started, we hadn't turned the machine on yet, but you and I were talking, and we were trying to refresh our memories because we don't have the book in front of us. And we were saying, well, let's remember now, what were some of the great battles? And there weren't any. Thucydides is absolutely wrong. That is, we can right away. There's Marathon and Plataea. These tremendous battles of the Persian Wars, but the Peloponnesian Wars didn't have a single decisive battle.
Well,
and yet Thucydides says, "Oh no, they were the greatest."
yeah, that's right.
That's because
there were more of them. There were more of them, but none of them was really great. It was the accumulation of all of them that makes for greatness, and yet there are no great figures, no very great generals. Alcibiades was again a genius. He was a genius.
Oh, yeah.
A fickle genius.
And again, one of the characteristics of genius is their multiplicity. They can do everything.
Yes.
Alcibiades was a general, a politician, a poet, a lover, a Renaissance man.
We would say. Oh my!
We use that phrase, the Renaissance man. He could do everything. Leonardo da Vinci was a scientist. He devised.
Yes, he invented the submarine.
Yeah, and we're sort of laughing at this. But boy, are we reactionaries. We didn't get along very well at the university for this reason. People felt that we were blasphemers. We were going against the common teaching of the modernistic university. That is, that these are the greatest men and these are the greatest periods in history. I remember someone saying, and it might have been very well that same man who wrote Science in the Modern World, Alfred North Whitehead, who wrote that chapter, The Century of Genius, about the 17th century. Someone said Pascal, the theologian, was a religious genius.
Yes.
Now, nobody ever called St. Thomas Aquinas a religious genius, or St. Augustine a religious genius, or St. John the Baptist a religious genius. You know?
Although some modernists have called Moses a religious genius.
Well, that's so ridiculous. But it's not ridiculous about Pascal. It's true.
Yes.
It's true.
That's right. Well, he belongs to, again, he's another 17th century genius.
I mean, Pascal was that's exactly what he was. It's an accurate description. So.
Yeah.
But that word genius is a telling one, and this is this age. One of its characteristics. So we've touched on so many of them now, and again, I think last time I was saying that in a conversation, what you do is you let your mind just go wherever it goes. But if it's a good conversation, it begins to turn. It isn't just going out in all directions haphazard. It will turn about a certain theme, about a certain thesis. There is a center to what we're saying here. There is an integral view here of everything that we're saying. There is a Periclean age. There is this century of genius. It was the 5th century BC, and that's considered, to be one of the greatest of all centuries of genius. And it's very like the description of the 17th century as the age of Newton, or the Renaissance in general.
The Renaissance was consciously imitating,
and consciously reviving
Pericles.
As a matter of fact, Greek went out with the coming of triumph of Christianity, the Roman dominance, and the Middle Ages was a Latin thing. St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, didn't know very much. He knew some, but he had small or less Greek. But the Renaissance was an age of Greek. That is, it was a mark of the educated man.
Oh yes. How many books will you find with written in Latin with poems, introductory poems written in Greek,
or titles in Greek,
or titles in Greek,
or Milton's Areopagitica, doesn't he call it the Areopagitica, which is taken from Aeschylus's Areopagus. That idea of the hill of Mars, which had been the hill of the Amazons. Oh, poor Milton. Milton had a struggle with Amazon.
But they. Though it was that was the mark of a really educated man. Was the knowledge of Greek. It was.
And I remember some years ago giving a talk over at a Jesuit college, and one of the Jesuit priests, teachers there, said, "Well, you made some references to the Latin here, but what about the Greek?" And I said, "Well, we're not really Greek. Ours is a Latin tradition." Oh, he just said, "Well, that's the." He said, "You lost. You lost. We won't pay any attention to you. That is, if the Catholic Church is anything, it's Greek. And if you don't study the New Testament in Greek, or that you don't know anything, and all theology must be Greek." Well, that is a modernistic idea. That's a Renaissance idea. And of course, the Jesuits are Renaissance order. God bless them again. They were geniuses. The Jesuits are an order of geniuses. With all of the greatness, there's no question about it, with all of the defects. Well, yes, this is an explosion, and it creates, and it destructs, and it self-destructs within one generation. The aristocratic age is a short one. We talked about this before. The aristocrat is a man who comes in at a moment of crisis, and the aristocratic age is an age that creates out of chaos some kind of principle, and it lasts only as long as that's a single generation. But then the Timocratic age is a long one, and it will last for 1,000 years, because it is essentially preservative. It continues it's traditional. It carries out the principles. It acts upon the principles given to it by the aristocratic age. And then comes the oligarchic time, which is a relatively short period, and the democratic time is almost instantaneous. It burns itself up and gives rise to slavery, which lasts, of course, forever.
This is an age of utter disorder. That is, democracy is a disordered age, and disorder cannot sustain itself perfectly obviously. We said in tragedy that tragedy is divisive, that it has no power to hold things together. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold, as Yeats says, and that's true of our times. And we see that gradual tendency of ours toward democracy, and then you get an acceleration of disorder, and that is precisely the age in which this war took place and in which Thucydides lived.
Now, at the moment of a democratic age, when this explosion takes place, we are given a choice. I think we can say we're put up there on that razor's edge when there are only two. The democratic age burns up everything, and there's nothing left. And you have a choice. You can be a reactionary, as Socrates and Plato and Aristotle were. And the reactionary word means go back, turn back. You can go back to the principles on which your civilization was founded. That's one choice. You can make that choice. And the other one is slavery. That is, you can move into what Plato called tyranny. And the wonder of tyranny is that it is stable, like an Egyptian pyramid. It does solve your problems. Someone once said, for example, there's no crime in the Soviet Union.
Right.
That's true.
Right. Well, it's not allowed.
I mean, problems are solved by slavery.
Yeah.
It's a great choice that we have before us.
It's exactly like a prison.
Today, right.
In a prison, you have no freedom, and they don't have the kinds of problems that you have in the